Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event from the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. Some of you I know Jesus extremely well. For those of you who don't, you're very welcome here in person or online. Jesus is a very old venue. We're originally a 12th century nunnery. We became a college in 1496 and have had many people who have gone on to change the world. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Clean Bandit more recently. I think only one commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, however, was a student here, Sir Harold Scott from 1945 to 1953, as I'm sure everybody here knows. The Intellectual Forum is a newer version of what we're trying to do here at Jesus, to communicate ideas and to get people to think and talk. So we've run events over the last 6 years with all sorts of amazing speakers. Many of those are available for you to watch on our YouTube channel, so please do have a look. And there's many more coming up tomorrow and in the future weeks. And I'm really delighted that we have an amazing speaker tonight for a really fascinating, somewhat controversial topic. It's a great pleasure to have Lord Bernard Hogan Howe. I think technically Lord Hogan Howe. I'm not supposed to use your first name, but it's good to have you. So Bernard joined the police in 1979 and had a very distinguished career in South Yorkshire, in Merseyside, and then in the Met. Was Met Commissioner from 2011 to 2017. And unlike both his predecessor and successor, he left when he wanted to leave with a clear choice, and then joined the House of Lords and continues to be involved in a range of interesting issues, advising the Cabinet Office, as well as, of course, shaping legislation. He's known for many things during his career, including an approach of total policing, which I'm sure he'll correct me or I get this wrong, with total professionalism from workforce, a total war on crime, total care for victims, and much more use of technology, which is really what we're going to talk about today. Now, I first got to know Bernard when I was on the Home Affairs Select Committee, and periodically Bernard would be brought in front of the committee to answer a range of questions. Some of the questions were, I'm sure, very good. Some of them were perhaps less good. The answers were always interesting. We didn't always agree on everything, but I always found it interesting and thought-provoking to hear what Bernard had to say, and I'm sure it's going to be the same thing today. So I'm going to invite Bernard to come and talk for a bit, and then we will have time for questions from people here in the audience live, but also people online, so I'll be keeping track of that to hear as we go. So do come on in and grab a seat. Bernard, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Over to you.
Right, good evening, everybody. And good evening to the people who are online. There's going to be something slightly terrifying going to happen tonight. I've got a pair of spectacles here, which I hate using. There's going to be the odd occasion. I'm not going to read out a speech. So if anybody's wanting a speech read out, I'm sorry. I will be deeply disappointed. But I've got a number of points I just want to make sure I cover. I'm not going to speak for an awful long time. It's good to see Julian again. As he mentioned, I used to appear before him in the Home Affairs Select Committee. Despite that, he invited me, which is good. His chair was always interesting as well, Keith Vance. But Julian, as he indicated, always asked sensible, honourable questions and listened to the answers. It seems to me, I hope that's what we'll get involved in tonight, and perhaps the debate and discussion we have afterwards will inform all of us about what I think is an important topic. The first thing I just want to say is, I suppose I approach this with some prejudice, in the sense that I remained the vocational policeman that I've been for nearly 40 years. I think it's a great privilege to ideally stop crime, or if necessary, arrest the offenders. And if you can do neither, not a bad idea to help the victims as best you can. You know, being a victim of crime can be a serious thing. I don't think there's any time when it's a minor thing. It's always an impact on your rights. So I think that's one of the prejudices I bring to this, is that you have to intervene if people are going to get hurt. You have to intervene if people are going to steal things, or whatever they happen to do that happens to be a crime. My point is not that everybody should go to prison. My point is not that everybody should be treated very seriously in terms of penalty, but it is an important thing. The CCTV, which is part of what we're going to talk about tonight, is something that's become ubiquitous, particularly in a place like London. I would argue it's become ubiquitous, i.e. everywhere, because there was no strategy to implement it. It's almost crept up on people. Its extent, I think, has got so broad because nobody realized quite it was how it came along. And in fact, I would say that on the whole, the public have accepted it. Although it can be intrusive, broadly they've accepted it. But now more recently, what we're seeing is obviously facial recognition and how cameras are used and how you apply the facial recognition to the camera, but also the material that the camera stores, the images it stores, and how this will go forward in the future. And I do, although I've confessed to a prejudice, I want to stop crime, arrest people, or help victims. I do think there is a big debate to be had about how you use those images and make sure that facial recognition works in a proper way. And I hope to come back right at the end as to some of the principles that I hope we're going to be able to apply in the future. I just want to start with just a couple of quick anecdotes. One is about when I took over in the Met, which was 2011. We just had the riots, the London riots of 2011. For those who remember it, maybe the people in the room who are online who aren't aware, but there were 3 awful nights. Many people got hurt. There were 2 murders in London, people murdered in Birmingham. Awful things, buildings set on fire. Riots are never going to be good things. It means that orders are broken down, and the weak often are the ones who are picked on. And of course, there were very few arrests at the time. But in the succeeding 18 months, one of the things that wasn't realized is that the Met we put together about 800 people. The 800 people looked at around 250,000 hours of CCTV footage. And during the succeeding 18 months, we arrested around 5,500 people, of which 78% were charged with a criminal offense, so not all of them. Of the 78% who were charged, around 95% pleaded guilty. So I imagine they believe they've done it. Not conclusive, but some indication. Now, that contributed to us over that 3 to 4 year period, reducing volume crime, so far as crime stats can tell you, by about 20%. Now, I'm going to talk, I realize I'm talking in lots of percentages, but I think it is important. 70% of the people who were arrested were people who already had a criminal conviction, and many of them were frequent offenders. So by taking out this cohort, we saw volume crime drop on the whole. We also saw some serious crime drop as well. So there were some positive outcomes. Of course, the challenge was the Met has about 50,000 people. It's a big organization. We couldn't afford, but we could manage to have 800 people looking at 250,000 hours of CCTV footage and trying to work out between systems how this person moved from that street to that car to do that damage, and then eventually identify the individual. But 800 people over 18 months, you can work out the cost. But of course, it's not just the money, it's also what could the people have done. So it always seemed to me that we ought to have had a more efficient way of doing it, which probably would involve algorithms or some kind of assessment of the CCTV footage. You've also got to bear in mind that whether or not the officers and the staff who were doing this, were they actually accurate in their identification? Now, the fact of guilty pleas tends to suggest they were, but it's not, again, conclusive. That's just one thought I'd like to hang on to. The second one is, I took over in 2011, about 2012 to 13, I met a man called Simon Gordon. Simon Gordon ran a wine bar, Gordon's Wine Bar. Ran it in the Westminster area, and he was sick and tired of people who would come into his bar and did what he would term table surfing. Table surfing is basically someone coming into the bar and stealing phones, bags from the tables. And people in central London, they would do this. They weren't recognized because they might live in Croydon, they might live somewhere else. So the staff didn't always recognize them, but they were just wandering around central London, waiting usually for a tourist to not pay attention to their stuff, imagine they were safe, and then they would steal. So what Simon Gordon did, he put a camera on the door as a contract, if you like, of entry into his private premises. He put on some facial recognition. He wasn't interested in identifying who they were. He just didn't want them to come in again if either they'd been violent or they'd stolen something, or in some other way he decided he didn't want them in this bar. So that was his way of using facial recognition. He eventually made it a business, because what he wanted to do was to link the various bars in the area so that it could all come to a similar conclusion. If they didn't want these people in, they at least warned that bar. It's up to you whether you allow them in, but there is some reason to believe that one place has said we don't want them in anymore. So this was a commercial and also a private space exercise. So those two things have remained with me as indications of how powerful facial image recognition could be, but also the fact that it's quite a big debate whether you talk about private space, profit, and whether you're talking about public service and trying to prevent crime over the period. Just as a quick discussion about taxonomy of public space, private space, and surveillance. The police and the state can use surveillance cameras and also facial recognition in private space. Sorry, in public space. There's something called in a covert way, which is the distinction. So they don't tell anyone. And that is covered by something called RIPA, or the Regulatory Powers Act. And there's a process to go through, which on discussion we might go into. But essentially, there's a control point about how that is deployed. What I really want to talk about tonight is the overt use of facial recognition, usually in public places, but not entirely. And it seems as though at the moment what's developed is that there are three ways to use facial recognition. So the first one is that you may use it live. So you have a live camera, and in the police's case, this is their camera in a public place that they put facial recognition on. It's overt, so they will put big signs up and they will warn people, that people in that area may be subject to facial recognition. So that's one way of doing it. There's a second way, which is that you might want to identify an individual, and there is actually, you point a camera at someone's face. Now, you may think that's pretty odd. You can imagine that from time to time, the police need to identify, frankly, bodies. So if you have a body that you might recover from a river or wherever it might be, and you don't know who it is, then one way that you can look at fingerprints, you look at DNA, but fingerprints requires that you have that person's records already to compare with. DNA takes quite a few days and has the same challenge. Have you got this person's DNA on your database? But facial recognition gives you another form of actually trying to identify. But quite often you are going to compare against the criminal record database. So it's just another way of doing it. So you're going to point a camera at an individual with the only purpose of trying to identify them so that you can establish identity for the relatives, or to establish how they died or what exactly happened in their final moments. And the third one is to apply it retrospectively to an event that has already happened, again, against the database of images. So if you looked in London, the Met, I don't know exactly what the figures are this year, but broadly speaking, it arrests around 250,000 times a year, not 250,000 people. Some people are arrested more than once. So it's each year, 250,000 images, sometimes of the same people. So you can imagine in 4 years, that's 1 million. These are people who often go on to be convicted of offences, but if they're not, their images should be removed. So you're looking at a database of people who historically have committed offences. And then you will get images from CCTV, perhaps from a petrol station, someone's driven off, there's been an attack. You might get from a bus, a taxi, the tube. You've got to establish, you've now got a picture of a person committing an offence, who are they? And it takes about 5 to 10 years. The way was to say, well, do you know them? You show it around the police station. If it was terrorism, the BBC would project it to 6 million people. You often quickly identified someone. But for most crimes, quite difficult. So the question is, can you now use facial recognition to compare the images of people who you believe have committed crime against people who in the past you know have, and to try at least get suggestions of how you might pursue that particular investigation. So it's a great opportunity, I would suggest, but at the moment it remains it's not an industrialized process. And people might say, and we will come to this, I'm sure, is, well, I hope it doesn't become an industrialized process. But for the reasons I mentioned in the 2011 riots, if you remember what we have, it's incredibly inefficient, even though you may come to the same conclusion. And it's very people intensive. I mentioned 800 people to look at 250,000 hours of footage. So really important that we get that right. Now, this area that we're talking about has been tested in the courts. There's been a Court of Appeal decision in the Bridges case, and it may be that people in the audience are aware of that. And this was a challenge against South Wales Police in their deployment of facial image recognition at 2 sporting events. And the Divisional Court, the High Court, had initially agreed with the police that they had used it properly. But in the end, the Court of Appeal concluded that it hadn't. And what I'm about to say might sound contradictory, but it is coherent. So the first point the Court of Appeal made was that it is entirely legal for the police to use facial recognition live in a public place. So that's okay, it's within the law. What they weren't happy was that the police had there were 3 areas in which they hadn't done enough work. So they sent it back to them to do that work. They have now done the work, but it hadn't been done at the time. The first was, you can imagine what you're trying to do is you're checking a series of images in a public place against what? Well, in this case, you check it against a watch list. And there were 3 categories of people within that watch list. But these were images they put on of people either wanted, so you may already know you want them, but you don't know where they are, who might be in that area. People who you had previously committed offences in that area. So there was a series of indices about how you created this watch list. And the Court of Appeal weren't happy that, in fact, that list had been created appropriately. It needed far more thought. So they weren't happy with the who test. The second test they weren't happy with was the where test. Where did you deploy this system? Why did you deploy it there? What was your argument for deploying it there? And although they had a good argument, they weren't convinced they considered every impact that could have been considered in this particular case. So they sent it away for that reason. And the third was probably the most worrying, was that in terms of assessing whether there was a differential in the algorithm that was behind the facial recognition, was it differential when it came to look at different races? And in fact, although they couldn't conclude it was, they weren't satisfied enough work had been done to establish that it wasn't, which is an important thing. So for those 3 reasons, now, the police will now say that they've gone away and addressed all of these things. Now, of course, we don't know conclusively because nobody's taken it back to the Court of Appeal and said, well, now we've done all this work, what do you think? Because either it's going to be established on a further case where somebody takes it as was in this case, a declaratory judgment, or somebody will say that their rights might have been infringed and it will be decided thereafter. So I think people have done an awful lot of work, but it remains, obviously a live issue. And at the end of the day, the Court of Appeal in that case decided against the police. I think one of the things that I'm not going to speak for an awful lot longer because I can see Julian twitching slightly. I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to run towards the end. But there are some difficulties, I think, for everyone in how we progress this. All right, you could look at the law. You could look at the codes that are applied to this area. But at the moment, you've got a series of regulators who are interested in the very thing that I'm discussing. So you've got the Information Commissioner. Now, their perspective, obviously, they're interested in the data. Where is the data held? How long is it held? Should it be held? Etc. So it's all about the data. Of course, every image and facial recognition has some data within it. The second group is the Biometric Commissioner. Now, Biometric Commissioner does what it says on the tin. They're interested in DNA, fingerprints, facial recognition. Now, they're interested, obviously, in that very matter. So they look at it from that perspective, mainly to see how the police, enforcement agencies, and security services use that type of technology. You've also got the College of Policing, who are interested because they're the ones who give the practice out to the cops in the UK. They're the ones who will say how the law should be applied and give approved practice. And then I'm just going to have to put my specs on for a second. For example, you've got the Centre for Data, Ethics and Innovation, which is a Whitehall-based body. And of course, you've got the Surveillance Commissioner, who's interested in how this operates too. There's nothing wrong with any one of those, but of course you might consider that they all think about this issue from a different perspective, which makes it no easier for the public to understand, well, what are our rights and how will this develop, nor frankly for the people who are charged on the enforcement side with trying to make best use of technology. So I'm not arguing that in fact all these things should be fused together. I'm just acknowledging that in what is already a complex area, different roles will not probably find it easy to agree on what the way forward is as the technology develops. So I think it's something we all have to anticipate. In terms of the system at the moment, I'd say that there are some inbuilt protections. So I've mentioned, the bridges example. The vast majority, I think nearly all the data on the CCTV system and the facial recognition templates is immediately erased once the test has been applied. So what happens is that people walking past the live camera, so they pick out the face, the box is put around the face, the algorithm is applied, it's checked against the list, and then it's a yes, no. Very few yeses, but obviously the vast majority knows. All the no's, the data is immediately wiped. So there is no storage of that device. Now we might say, well, intuitively that sounds great because it's got rid of. There is a bit of a dilemma because if somebody complains the following day that I think I was photographed, I don't agree, I think you didn't have the signs, that they weren't big enough, there's actually no record of that they were there. So although intuitively we might think actually it's far better to get rid of the data, it doesn't always allow anybody to, for themselves, to establish whether or not their photographs taken or that they were dealt with appropriately. So I think it's the right thing to do, but there are perhaps some unintended consequences. But I think that there are protections in there, and I know that Julian, actually, as it happens, sits on an ethics board for the Home Office. There are a series of boards around who are considering not from anybody's personal perspective, trying to apply an independent judgment to how this technology develops to make sure that it's ethical. And it's not just the Home Office. You get, I think the Met have got an ethical board, South Wales Police have got one. South Wales Police have to be the lead for the country. And I think the final protection I would argue is in place is that although this technology is evolving quickly, the police's use of it, I would say, has evolved slowly. And the reason it's evolved slowly, in part, they've been challenged in courts, but I think genuinely they want to get it right. And they appreciate that not everybody will be persuaded that they're using it properly, effectively, and that it couldn't be improved as well. But it's certainly been evolving over the last 5 years when the technology has evolved far more quickly. The only final couple of points I wanted to make is I've already mentioned, but in fact, I've concentrated what I've been saying mainly on the state, how enforcement agencies use it. But commercially, it's evolving at a far faster pace in a way that people I don't think even anticipate. So in my research for tonight, having talked to the head in the Met of their project around facial recognition, she pointed out to me that in fact some commercial hotels now are using it to select which customers to serve first in a bar. It's a commercial decision. It's in a private space. Presumably, they think they're going to make more profit out of either repeat customers or preferential customers. I don't know. It's not. I don't understand why they're doing that. I just merely observe that, as is usual, commercially, the rate at which this is progressing is far more, I would argue, intrusive for motives which aren't about protecting you from harm, but for making profit. I'm not saying that profit is bad. I'm just merely saying that these things are happening without surveillance of how these powers are being used. And it seems to me we have to consider that at the same time. There are future challenges to come. One of the things that clearly happens, I've explained how the police will use it to compare an image from a crime scene or from somewhere they're trying to identify with a list of people who usually are either, they fall into two broad categories, people who have committed a crime and been convicted. There are the only other images I can think that they would use, for example, if someone is missing. Again, if you've got a series of people who are missing, you might want to compare the dead body, sadly, against that list. And in any case, if you are in an area and you've got a 14-year-old boy, girl who is vulnerable and maybe susceptible to any kind of exploitation, you want to get them home as quickly as possible. You may argue that that's not a bad idea to find them quickly, and you might want to use that. But you can't say you're doing it to stop crime, other than anticipation that as a vulnerable person, they may become subject to it. And it may be you've got some knowledge that that's the type of thing that might happen to them, given their own history. But my final point is only this. In what I think is a rapidly evolving technological area, and for the reasons I've expressed, I think commercially it's happening quicker. I think we do need to, one, assess how it might be effective, but also how we might improve the protections for citizens and those affected by facial recognition. And if I was to offer some thoughts about where I think the principles of that protections might lie, I would say number one is transparency about how these things work and where they are operating. And to be very open about the things that are being done. I think number two is that you have to be open, and we're probably on discussion, we'll talk about this, but the algorithms are being used. What are the underpinning features of them? Have they been tested against different criteria, and have they been found to be ethical? Have they been found to be appropriate? But if they are okay, then why not just publish them? Now, I would have no clue about whether an algorithm technology was of any use. But I think we could all draw some conclusions about whether the underpinning reasoning behind the algorithms appeared fair or could be challenged. So I think openness is a vital part of it. I think the second is independent audit. In most of the things that the law enforcement agencies, security agencies do, there are independent auditors. There are surveillance commissioners who are usually people like retired Court of Appeal judges, very able people, very straight people who will not take nonsense And my experience is they are usually forensic and ruthless. Now, you can have different views about independent regulation, but I think it's vital, particularly in this area. I think having agreed codes that are published and agreed in public, could be through Parliament, but you know, I think the only thing we have to watch is if we make everything entirely new law, this is moving at such a pace that it won't keep pace. Julian will know, and I've experienced more recently, law will usually take years to, one, get a good idea, then write it, then get its place in Parliament, which is a big argument about what should take precedence. It just takes ages. Some goes, I mean, like today, we've had this awful experience in Ukraine. Law's gone through very quickly through Parliament about sanctions, but that's, if it's not unique, it's unusual. It takes a long time for good reason, because everyone wants to talk about it and make sure they get it right. So I think codes, agreed codes, are vital. And the final one, which is something I personally feel strongly about, is that you can have all the great systems in the world, you can advertise it and make it transparent, you can get agreed codes, but if you're an individual who feels wronged by it, then that hardly matters. You need a remedy, I would argue. You need, one, someone to complain to, two, for someone to take your complaint seriously and look into it and find out whether from their point of view they think you're right. And the third one, which I think is the most important thing, is if you have been wronged or the thing's been operated wrongly, then who's going to do something about it? I don't think it's about necessarily financial compensation. It might be removing an image from a database. It might be rearranging the way this thing is organized, advertised, different things. But I think individuals should be able to get a remedy that matters and makes difference for them, and that seems to impact on the way the system's operated in the future. I hope I haven't gone too long, but I hope I have given you just a few things to think about in what I think is a rapidly evolving area. And although I confessed to prejudice at the beginning, I hope you will accept that I think there are dangers. And I think unless we develop in a way the public trust, then we are like to lose the opportunity. I don't think you can disinvent the technology. I think that's almost impossible. So I think regulation and development of the law, the codes around it, are the wisest way forward. And we've got to consider that whether you control the state, you've got to consider what commerce is doing at the same time. But Julian, first of all, thanks for listening, and then happy to join the discussion.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for setting all of that out. And there's a lot of very interesting things there. And I do really want to have lots of comments and questions from people here and also online, and some are coming in. I notice, I won't out anyone here, but there's definitely a few people with a particular interest in this. And I say at least one former chief constable, I see a number of my colleagues in the biometrics and forensics ethics group, and various others who may have particular opinions about the Bridges case, for example. So we will have a number of questions that come in, but just before we do that, and questions from here in the audience as well, can I perhaps, given you mentioned Ukraine and some of those issues there, one issue is that there's what we do here in the UK, where we have a particular approach to policing. We have the Pelian principles, which set out that the main thing is to reduce crime, not to arrest people afterwards. It talks, at that level about the need for public approval. That's not true everywhere in the world. And we see with lots of pieces of legislation where we do something because we have a certain trust in our legal system of oversight, and then it gets taken up elsewhere. Do you have concerns that we could end up doing things here with some checks and balances that could lead other countries with, let's say, a more authoritarian approach, Russia, China, to take a different angle? Do you have any thoughts on that? And if I stand out of the way, you can stand and everyone can see you.
I think there is a risk. I don't think it's the biggest risk. I think for me, the risk probably there. I mean, frankly, I'm going to try and avoid talking about particular countries. But if you look, for example, at the Middle East, then in the Middle East, they've got some benefits of developing this type of system. There's some risks, but there's some benefits. So what they have is, first of all, technologically, they start from a clean sheet. They haven't always had all the systems I've described, so they can start again. They often have the capital investment that can invest widely. And I think to your point, I think there's not always been the same consideration of individual rights compared to the state's rights. And I'm not going to be too pejorative about that, because we've got it wrong at times. I don't think it's a country-based thing, but I think that is true. And we could name other countries where that is true. But I think what's more likely, frankly, if we get it right, that others might learn from it. I don't think if we were getting it right, others are like to ignore that. But some countries may not want to follow that line, and you have to accept. We over lunch, over dinner, we was quickly saying that, you're someone like me or security services, the temptation at times is to push that boundary as far as you can. You try and genuinely to do it for the right reasons, but some spots, you're getting this wrong, and this is why. And so I think that debate is always valuable and valid. So I don't see it being amplifying the risk in the way that you describe. If we get it right, if we get it wrong, we might run the bad thing around the world, I guess.
So let's start off with some questions over here. We've got, there's one over there. I might try and take pairs if there's a second one here, and then I'll take a couple from on here. Yeah, so the two at the front there. And can I say, by the way, for the people online, you can ask questions anonymously if you like. If you provide your name, I will pass it on. So, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So my question is, where do the images in the database, the ground truths, come from? Is it just for mugshots for people with criminal records, or do you go through social media or even like residence permit applications?
Generally, the ones I'm discussing are the ones that come from the police national database. And the source of that is usually people who've been through custody. I mean, there will occasionally be times when that's not the case, but they are associated with an offence which eventually they get convicted. But as I indicated, the London accounts for probably about 22% of all arrests in the country. It's a big city. And I mentioned the figures, 250,000 images a year, something of that order. But that is the source. On arrest, there are there's four things that happen. You establish identity, you take a photograph, you take DNA, and you take fingerprints. And they're for two reasons. It's confirm identity, and number two is potentially link them to a scene of a crime for which they have not yet been identified. So you have, every crime scene should be examined for DNA fingerprints. And then you want to make a comparison later if you don't establish identity at the time. So that's the source. So they don't troll open source. And I can't think of any other, apart from the ones I mentioned, which are the missing from homes, who've committed any offence other than to be vulnerable. And you're trying to identify somebody to protect them, or ensure they get home, or whatever's going to happen to them next, even if they're not going to go home as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you'd given any consideration to the criminal use of facial recognition, so that the use of facial recognition by criminals, for instance, identifying where people are, when they're out. You mentioned commercial use, and there must be a line to be drawn on commercial use as well. What's legitimate commercial use, and what crosses the line into criminal use?
Yeah, I mean, if I was on the other side of the argument, the way you describe, if you're like a criminal, then I might be interested in facial recognition for surveillance officers. Repeatedly you're seeing similar face in a certain area, or you'd establish someone as a surveillance officer, did you see them later? So you can see why criminals may be attracted to it. At the moment, I mean, the technology is not reserved. It's not like nuclear technology. There's not as far as I'm aware, anybody could buy it, I presume create it. So there is a risk that it can be used malevolently. I suppose they have to follow the same rules and laws. But I think there's a danger at the moment that the law criminal law, which is your question, is behind the curve, probably more than the state or commercial use. But there is a risk it's badly used. And I probably shouldn't go any more examples I've just offered, but I can imagine one or two where a criminal would be really interested to use it.
There's, to chip in my own thoughts on the occasion, I won't do it too often. There is an interesting question about which bits of society we regulate. I remember doing state surveillance work, as I used to do. I wouldn't want GCHQ to be the only people who can't read my emails. If criminals can, if all sorts of other commercial groups can, the only people who can't are the security services. That doesn't strike me as quite right. How do we get that? I said we had some interesting people online. There's a number of really interesting questions, and I thought I would start off with I think the only person you named in your talk. So Ed Bridges, as somebody with a particular interest in the Bridges case, asks, I wondered what people's views are on whether facial recognition technology is compatible with protecting the right to peaceful protest. It strikes me that people often have good reason to want to take part in protests without having their name and identity made known to the police, not least if it's the police against whom they're protesting. How can such considerations be recognised in law?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult area. And I think it's a difficult area. And we're seeing this there's a present public inquiry into undercover officers. and where they were deployed against. And the dilemma, and I say this as previous chief and commissioner, is that essentially there is no reason why the police should be at all interested in who turns up for a protest. It's a right. Why shouldn't they? The dilemma is only that if 10,000 people turn up or 200,000 people turn up for a protest and the police arrive with 2 people, there's a bit of a mismatch. Now, even if everybody in that crowd is well behaved and has no intention to break the law, at the very least with those numbers, you're going to probably block the highway. You can imagine things get interrupted. Things will develop in a crowd. I mean, people will collapse, people have things stolen, the normal things happen. So one of the realities of policing is wherever you have lots of people, you tend to have crime or some events, and the police tend to react. I think it's point 1. So how do you respond as a public service? And it's not only the police, the ambulance service want to know, the fire service want to know. There are many people in public services who want to know about these large gatherings of people for the very reason the police are interested, other people are interested too. So some intelligence about broadly numbers is always of interest, magnitude. But the second thing you have to anticipate, and cops get caught out by this sometimes, and if they do, people criticize them, is that even in a crowd of 100,000, 200 people who intend to cause damage, hurt people, or do something that's criminal can be a problem. 1, because 200 is still quite a lot of people to deal with. And probably as importantly, they get hidden amongst the large crowd and the cops can't do anything. So it's not about whether they commit, it's not about whether they protest. But if you start breaking windows, it's your house they're going to hurt. It's your, we've seen people attacked in their homes who have been parts of certain companies who people want to protest against. I defend the right to protest, but I also defend the right for somebody to enjoy their home, not have the kids frightened or wherever else it happens to be. So I suppose the police are always interested in, if there are to be groups who they anticipate and have intelligence are going to commit criminal offences, they either want to stop them getting involved before the event, or if they do start to have cause problems, they are prepared, which I think is the secondary issue. The problem can be, of course, is that sometimes people say, look, I just want to protest. I may go to multiple protests. It may even be while I'm at a protest, some crime breaks out. Not my fault. Why are you interested in who I am? And that's the dilemma, is getting that balance right. And I can only say, except from a police perspective, if you get that wrong, you turn up with too few, people break into the Treasury or wherever it happens to be. Somebody said, well, surely you must have known that this was likely to happen. Well, how do you think that happens? You can only do it based on intelligence, i.e. what do you anticipate is going to happen? And then you're interested not only in who's there, where they are, and what they might be doing. And you've got 2 choices. You either follow them around, which is people intensive, or you can use surveillance of some kind. So it's a difficult balance to strike in protest, particularly I acknowledge. May not be the same in a football crowd, but it may. So there are different types of crowds, but I acknowledge Ed's point, which is that in a protest, in a liberal democracy, it can be a difficult balance to strike.
There's an interesting thread before we take another question here, and I'll do put a hand up if you've got a question here about, you're talking about the intelligence and understanding the numbers for protests, and I can understand that. I've seen some various protests from various sides, but you don't need facial recognition, presumably, to get an estimate of whether there's going to be 200 or 100,000 people showing up for something.
You're quite right.
We were talking about this earlier.
You're quite right. I think I was just trying to make the point there are various reasons why you're interested in who turns up to protest, which if I was a protester, I might say, well, why do you need to know whether I'm coming? I'm just making the point that you need to know broadly an estimate of how many are coming. There's a secondary issue that if you've got people in the crowd who may be intent, and there have been, people who are intent on, they're not always interested in the protest, they are interested in committing crime. And you could argue that sometimes law changes because people commit crime. Well, that's okay, but the cops are never going to be getting involved in that too much. They have to keep people safe, do the best to keep people safe, and keep it to be a lawful protest. And people have got a right to protest. They don't have a right to commit criminal damage. They don't have a right to injure people. They don't have a right to stop ambulances helping people. And we have seen some of that at times. I don't push that too far, but if it's your father who's had a cardiac arrest and needs an ambulance to get down a road, I think you might expect the police to do something about it or prevent it if you can. So these are the reasons why the police are interested. Then there's a secondary issue of how you identify people who might be intent on committing a particular problem in a large crowd. And I say you've got 2 broad alternatives. You follow them around, you find them in a crowd hard, or you follow them from wherever you can pick them up. or you start to think about how you might use technology to help you in that endeavor.
I'll come to more questions here in a second, but there's a question from a colleague on the BFEG, Nina Hallowell, which sort of slightly relates. To what extent do you think the use of this technology has a chilling effect in terms of preventing people walking freely around public spaces? There's footage of police stopping members of the public trying to avoid facial recognition cameras in London. Do you think that's acceptable policing, and how does that fit with the public acceptability issues?
Well, I mean, if there was evidence of that, you'd have to think about it. I've not seen that evidence. I've not heard evidence of people avoiding places. I mean, I think one thing you have to address at some point, I've explained, I hope clearly, is that when the police use it in a public space and it's overt, there are big notices. If you're a criminal who knows you're wanted, or is about to commit a crime, I guess you avoid the camera. Now, you could argue, well, that's a really good prevention thing, because the thing that you were worried about them doing, they didn't do. But of course, they may just walk down the other street and do it somewhere else. I think one thing we'd have to address at some point, if it has a value, I'll give you a slight analogy. When we run, if you have a roadblock, at night perhaps, or wherever you stop a series of cars, let's say you've had a problem with drink driving, you've had a problem with robberies or whatever, you decide to do a series of roadblocks. I'm always intrigued, not by the people who stop at ideally, if you light it well, you sign it well. I'm intrigued not only by the people who stop at the roadblock, I'm interested in the ones who turn off before they get there. And there's every chance that people would turn off before they get there to these areas. We have to accept that that's a human behavior we have to anticipate. But I've not seen the evidence people are avoiding areas, but they certainly have the option. Once you tell them, it's going to be deployed, either because they want the privacy protecting, or presumably because some of them are criminals who are wanted and don't want to get caught. And that group, I'm now interested in the tactics to find them where they went.
Yeah, and there's an interesting question that follows on from that about, these are two very different groups of people, and you don't necessarily want to target one with a brush for the other. Yeah. Any more questions here? There's more online, but there's one up here. Yeah.
I was just wondering on your thoughts in terms of the active use, and is there the potential to, in a way, victimize criminals in terms of their continually being monitored? So, they've been convicted of a crime, they've served their time, they're back out again, they're potentially not going to reoffend, but they're now forever being tracked, that wherever they go, there is something that's continually monitoring them. So them having to face that, whereas other people who may commit crime for the first time don't. So both their liberties, but also could it lead to the police becoming too hyper-focused on existing committers, where they're spending so much time dealing with the data from active tracking, they're not able to focus on new offenders or typical scenarios where they might be monitoring people who could be about to commit crime who haven't before?
Yes, I mean, there's a risk. I think there's an equivalence with things like DNA and fingerprints. So at the moment, if someone is, if they're not convicted of an offence, then there's a limit on the amount of time you can hold the fingerprints and DNA. I think from memory, I apologize, I think 6 years, something of that order. You can argue that both ways. You could say if someone's been found not guilty, you should get rid of it straight away. But the present law says that you can keep it for a period of time, even if there's not a conviction. But it used to be, to your point, that in fact you could keep it forever. There's the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, which says that if you're convicted of certain offences, it will always be recorded, and you have to reveal it. Murder, rape would be examples. But if it's a relatively minor offence, even if you've gone to prison, there's a time at which that conviction becomes spent, as you said. So should you apply for a job, and you would normally have, in the preceding time, had to reveal your conviction for theft or whatever it had to be. In fact, you don't have to reveal it anymore. There's an exception to that, which is that if you go for certain occupations, like being a cop, judge, or whatever, then you have to forever. That's a restricted list of occupations. So to your point, I think you're right. You would have to make sure that the images are retained only for so long, particularly where there was no conviction. The only thing, and I say this to a policeman, on the whole, most criminals start young. Most criminals don't start at 55. There tends to be, I'm afraid, at once started. And you can argue it always, sociologically, you could just say that they can't get a job after that. So that's what tends to happen. They get good at certain things. If they produce amphetamines, then that's what they keep doing because that's their business essentially. So on the whole, they've appeared in the system young and they carry on. There's a point often where they drop off out of the system, usually when they've got a relationship, job, home, somebody who cares for them, then things, people can rehabilitate. But often we do see that people who commit serious offences later have committed some offence before, and some offences can be precursors, particularly if you look at things like sexual offences. So you don't often want to forget about them entirely. But that can be argued both ways. I say that as a cop who wants to investigate offence and catch them. And you could say, well, if someone's committed an offence at 18, what relevance has it? But quite often they come back again at 22, 28, and so on. So I would always want to be aware that they've been involved in that crime without saying, therefore, they must have committed that offence. But the debate you enter into, I think, is a fair one. Can you reform?
I'll take a question over here. James.
Are you arguing for a constant use of facial recognition 24/7, say in a city like London, or are you arguing that it needs to be target specific, say, for example, a demonstration or if there's a riot? And how do we limit the uses or the abuses if it becomes too blanket?
No, I'm not arguing for comprehensive full-time use. I think you can make an argument for things like airports. Now, you could argue that everybody who goes through an airport, their identity is established because they've got a passport. Sadly, we know that many terrorists who travel, serious organised criminals, that's not a bar to them travelling. So there is an argument for saying actually facial recognition in our ports could be valuable constantly. You could argue for other places, but I gave it as an example. But I think the ubiquitous use of it in all places, I wouldn't argue for. The only thing I would point out is that at the moment we have another system which I think is analogous, but not entirely. We have the automatic number plate recognition system, which I think many people are aware of, but not always realise they're driving past. I think many do. The most obvious one being the congestion charge in London. I don't think you don't have a congestion charge here yet, apparently. Oh, yeah. So for the joy of those who live in London, you drive past it. For those who go in central London, you pay the privilege of £15 for being photographed with your number plate every time you go past it. And that is true around the country. There, not only for congestion charge reasons, but for other reasons, there are cameras out there. They're all marked. People forget them and they lose track of it. But they're out there to capture number plates. And the reason they capture number plates is because it's the association with the ownership of the vehicle or the use of it. So somebody, if the car's been stolen, you're interested. Has it got tax? Is it insured? Does the person who drive it carry drugs? Do they carry firearms? There was a series of things you're going to be interested in, and it helps to make the stop of that vehicle, should you do it, hopefully more intelligent. And that, to your point, I don't think is ubiquitous. There isn't a camera everywhere, but the country's got good coverage. I would not say strategically effective. I think it could improve, but at least there is. I'm just acknowledging that in fact that system's there all the time, and we drive past it, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. It's not as intrusive as facial recognition, but some of the cameras do capture people, but not with the application of facial recognition. So I think you have to be careful and make a clear argument if you want to do it.
It's an interesting question with ANPR, partly because when you think of a human rights perspective, there's a big difference between whether you have the right to drive somewhere without it being known that you're driving there versus whether you have the right to be somewhere. And I think that there is an interesting distinction there, but it is fascinating how there isn't the conversation as much as I think there ought to be about ANPR as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, ANPR works in two broad ways again. I mean, number one is that, there are alerts on the system, should you be interested in the driver. So you want the driver of that, you want them for a murder, you want them for whatever the crime is. Then you need to find the car. If the car is used in crime, you would be interested. Retrospectively, I've talked about retrospective facial recognition. You may want to establish where a car is at a particular time, let's say a murder, because it could establish an alibi as well as it could establish a prosecution. So it's important material. And, essentially it is a mobile society, and many people, not everyone, but many people travel using a vehicle. I would say it's been a great innovation. But people will want to say, well, what are the limits of that innovation?
There's more questions. I'd like to move on to a slightly different subject online, which is about bias. So Zoe Margolis says she's got a two-part question. Is there data about possible racial bias in the facial recognition software algorithms used by the police? You mentioned this, but it would be nice to more. And secondly, how can police ensure they address any racial bias in facial recognition software, both in terms of the algorithm itself and the human interpretation of it?
Okay. I'm going to start in slightly, but I'm going to answer the two questions. I'm going to do my best. I think that the biggest challenge often is people bias. If you take out, technology, which is what we're talking about, it's far more bias, I think, in people than probably is in technology. But clearly, it can be built in because people design the algorithms and sometimes indirectly apply the prejudices that we all carry. I think in terms of the Bridges case, if I understand, and I'm not a lawyer, I did read through the judgment before I came tonight, but my understanding is that I don't think the Court of Appeal said that in fact the algorithm was racial, or it was applied unequally to different races, but there wasn't sufficient evidence to show that that wasn't the case. And that's not, I don't think that's a fine point, it's an important point. So they sent them away to prove they could. I believe they have. I can't tell you the exact logic of that, but a lot of work could be done. To the second part, how do you do that? I confess I'm not sure. I don't design algorithms, but I do acknowledge that sometimes not only have you got direct bias, you've got indirect bias, which obviously all of us can be unaware of. I think it's entirely possible to do your best to remove that bias, but I think I think we've just got to be quite careful. You could have bias within an automated system. I just wonder if it's as bad as the bias that we have in people. I won't want to replicate the people one, but it might, even if it's not perfect, it might be better. It may be. So I think we've got to think through it carefully, but I'm not in a position to say how you do that.
I'm tempted to talk about stop and search and some of the problems that there's been with racial bias in that, which you're very familiar with.
Which is, yeah, I mean, one of the things that, when I took over in London, we reduced stop search by 2/3 because I wasn't happy that we're doing it properly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big issue. There was a question up here, and then there's one back there. So, oh, sorry. We won't have that question. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Over there.
Hi. I wonder if there are any rules or regulations regarding where does this technology comes from, which countries can be suppliers of this technology for the Met Police or London Police, because in Latin America, we know most of the providers come from China and Israel and even the United Kingdom. So I don't know if you can tell us how that, and also on that regard, when you talk about the algorithm, who makes the algorithm? Is it the companies that are the providers, or is it like something that you make with them and you sit down with them and try to influence in some way?
The first point, in terms of where does it come from and whether there's a list, if you like, of countries that they wouldn't take it from, I'm not aware that there are those lists. I suspect that there are probably some countries you would want to check more than others, that the algorithm satisfies you. What I am aware is that everybody works hard with the providers who are providing it now for law enforcement to do their best to ensure that first of all, the company who are selling it have got to share the algorithm, at least with the buyer, i.e. the law enforcement agency, which allows them to get good people to test the very thing that we are both, I think, worried about. But in terms of the second part of the question was about.
Do you use an algorithm made by the companies?
Sorry, I think
Could you wait for the microphone so we can?
I think it's just for the people online.
Yeah, no. You are on track. Do you use an algorithm provided by the suppliers of the technology, or do you have any influence in changing and adapting that algorithm?
I think the starting point is that I think in the past, research has been done about algorithms for facial recognition, which will have been carried out in universities, just general technology, and of course by commercial entities. As far as I'm aware, then what tends to happen when you're procuring these things, buying them, is that of course there is a spec, there's a procurement specification, and certain things will be expected in that. One of the things they will put in that spec is that they don't want racial bias, of course. It will be explicit, and then they will test it by really making the company be open about the software, as far as you ever can be open about these things, and then test it. So I think that's the way that, that's the process. And of course, you've got, in the same way that we're talking about procurement and how you develop it from a law enforcement point, you have got academics who are interested in it. And you have to accept that some software companies have left bugs in things that none of us have been happy with. It's not, your gateways have been left in software that have had malicious intent. So I think we're all aware of that. It doesn't make it always easier to spot. And as you know, ransomware can be applied after the application of software, which puts another gateway in. And both are serious issues, I think, not only for what we're talking about. So I think people do their best to get the original right, but there is always a risk for any software, I think, that you'd be aware probably that, further corruption of it could be a real problem. But I think at the beginning, that's the process they use.
There's an interesting question about evidence. And if I remember correctly in the Bridges case, there was, I think South Wales police were saying that there was no evidence of bias. And there's a distinction between having no evidence of bias and evidence of no bias.
Yes.
And that, not looking is not the same as looking and finding there isn't a problem.
Yeah.
And, there's a question about how much study is needed before it's okay to use something.
Yeah, and I'm saying this is a bit of a dilemma for the law enforcement agencies. They lost the Court of Appeal case. The Court of Appeal basically sent them away to do more work, do more homework. But then the question is, well, how do you establish whether the homework worked? I believe from what I've heard of it, I think it has. But if you're a skeptic, you want to be reassured of that for the very reason you mentioned.
You also mentioned companies and their involvement, and quite a lot of companies, Microsoft, Amazon, and a few others said, IBM, I think maybe, said they weren't prepared to allow law enforcement to use facial recognition tools. What's your reflection on that attitude?
I've confessed to, I think already, I don't use Facebook. In fact, I don't use social media. But I believe, and this is where I'll test anybody who is using Facebook or any other social media site, you can already use facial recognition on things like Instagram. I think there are other ways it's done. So I don't think it's unique to use facial recognition for what presumably people accept are positive reasons, because they're still members of Instagram or wherever it happens to be. So they must think that there is a positive to that. So I find it odd that some companies think that, the very companies that you mentioned, think they don't want to get involved. I find that odd.
There's a question from Tom Lloyd, who you may...
Oh, yes. For those who don't know, Tom used to be the Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire.
Indeed. And he says, are the concerns expressed about the use of facial recognition more concerns about the integrity of individual police officers and or the organisation as a whole potentially abusing the technology, rather than the use of the technology itself?
Well, actually, we ought to ask this of Ed. I don't know. I can't speak for Ed, and I can't speak for Liberty, who were the ones who brought this case or supported this case. My impression is I don't think they were worried about the individual officers. They were worried about the system. I'm not saying they've never had a concern about individual officers, because the individual officer in a good system may still misapply it. But I've not heard that they're worried about how they were applying it. I mean, just for example, one safeguard which I wasn't aware of until I did a bit of research is that when they're deploying it live, so that you have the camera out, you have the posters out, and people walk past the camera, and they look at the monitor to see what for the hits inside a van or a building nearby, very nearby, because they have to react if they get a positive. But actually, when the box goes around the face, the officers in the van don't see that face. It's blurred, because there's no reason they need to look at the face unless it says this is somebody's wanted or whatever it has to be. So I only offer it as an example of what they've tried to do to make it lacking in intrusion into privacy. And as far as I'm aware, for Tom, I've not heard that individual officers are challenged from time. Things like stop search. There were people, are they racially biased in the way they do it? Do they do it badly? Do they stop people and never arrest anyone? The reason for which they stop them is proved not to be true. But in this case, I don't think so. And the only final thing I would add, before I left the Met, we gave, partly on the grounds of the stop search problem, we gave 23,000 cops body-worn video. Now, body-worn video, I would say, is first generation. So all it does is record an image. It records the people you meet or whatever you see. And that's all it does. It records that. As I say, we experimented for 18 months. We piloted for 18 months. And then we rolled it out across all of London. In the pilot areas, and I don't know how it eventually panned out for the 23,000, in the pilot areas, the least reduction in complaints we got was 50%. And the most was 80%. So this was usually where a member of the public either being stopped or wherever the officer was doing had complained about the officer's behaviour or how they'd exercised their powers. but we'd see these big reductions. Now, I think you can only conclude two things from that. Either the officer had improved their behavior, and I said the officer, but the officers had improved their behavior and reduced the complaints, or previously complaints have been alleging things that weren't accurate. Either way, things have got better. So there was evidence that perhaps things hadn't been going well. But I think, generally speaking, surveillance transparency improves police behavior. And the final example I'll give of that is that when we introduced CCTV into cell areas, lawyers into interviews, and recording of interviews, police behavior improved. And very rare now for police behavior in the police station, not impossible. Generally speaking, you don't get many court of appeal decisions where the officers lied. So where things are recorded and where you can return to it and check, generally, police behavior, I can always speak for police, I'm not speaking for other occupations, police behavior improves. You may regard that as a sad indictment, but the bottom line is, I think that transparency to improve the behavior and the event is a better thing to happen. You could argue it's an intrusion to privacy. I happen to think it's a positive benefit of a level of intrusion into police powers that leads to better outcomes.
It's really interesting. And I remember, I think Rand, was it Alex Sutherland at Rand who did some of that research on the body-worn cameras? I'm trying to dredge back.
I'm not sure.
But it was very interesting results. As you say, there are two bad things you want. You don't want bad behavior by police, and you don't want ill-founded complaints. And if you can reduce both of those, that's probably quite a good thing. So can I, well, again, we'll have do let me know if there are questions around here, otherwise I'll keep taking them from online. There's another question from Nina Hallowell about where this goes. So she says, do you think that law enforcement will be making a case for emotion recognition, gait recognition, or all sorts of other recognition technologies? Is there a line somewhere?
Well, I think each of those is interesting. I think I would explore them for one reason initially. One is that, of course, facial recognition is not perfect now. I doubt it ever will be. So even if you get a hit rate of 80%, 90%, it means that 10% is inaccurate, and you may intervene in someone's life in a way that is unhelpful. So it's never going to be perfect, but I think if you added voice recognition, gait recognition, the chances are that you're going to come to a pretty conclusive definition about who this person is. So I think as an aid to identification, it could be valuable. I think the second one, by coincidence, Julian and I discussed this earlier, is that I've said already, I think there are some advantages to CCTV, some risks, but I think some advantages. But in Holland, they had an experiment where in trying, I hope that people believe this on the point, but in public areas or anywhere, before violence starts, or sometimes crime is committed, the ambient noise increases. Now, intuitively, this makes sense. People get more and more aggressive, they get louder, and then there is violence, or it might be a robbery or whatever. So what the Dutch experimented with was having noise microphones in public space at a high level, which were tuned not to listen to people. That wasn't the point. They then set a standard distribution of noise, and beyond 2 standard deviations, normally you've got an unusual event. And when it went beyond that, the 2 nearest cameras looked to see what the cause of the noise was. And sometimes they saw a barking dog, or whatever else it was, but sometimes they picked up a crime. So I think I'm intrigued by ideas, and I'm intrigued by the use of technology, as Julian mentioned earlier. I think sometimes we can find positive. We've started to talk about facial recognition, but to the question, I think other things can be added to make it more accurate, or to consider other benefits that might eventually evolve. But all of it would need to be checked.
So one of the things in Nina's question was about emotion recognition. I'd like to come back to actually one of the questions.
Oh, I missed that. Was that emotion?
Emotion recognition. And so that
probably I could do that.
but it's actually a particular case which I came across actually lecturing. A student told me about it. That in some parts of India, they've started installing this. I think Uttar Pradesh and Lucknow, they installed a scheme. They were reasonably concerned about women being assaulted and attacked. And so they set up a scheme that would do facial recognition and recognize when a woman's face appeared distressed and dispatch people, which is an interesting approach. I haven't, I admit, yet met a woman who would like that to be the case, but feel free to disagree. Is that something which you think would be interesting or useful? Not necessarily that particular
as an
case,
idea, I would be interested. I mean, one of the things we've experimented with, I think, in this country, America, and probably other places, is that if you look at something like a transport hub, then although it always looks a mess, people are traveling all over the place, and you've got thousands, tens of thousands of people moving, let's say, through Heathrow, or let's say central London. And I, as a cop, I came from the north of England, never worked or lived in London, and it always looks like a melee of people to me. You've got tens of thousands of people. I saw no pattern in life. As an officer, quite often you are looking for unusual patterns. The person who hangs about on the corner, whatever it happens to be, may not be a criminal, but you might be intrigued by that. We'd all notice it. That's a bit unusual behavior. So what they've experimented with in railway stations, airports, is the person who acts outside the norm may be interesting. Now, it may be just the ill. This is a precursor to them collapsing with a cardiac arrest or where it has to be. Or it may be that they're anticipating a crime. Some people go to Heathrow just to steal things. It looks like everybody's going in or out, but actually people get on the tube, get to Heathrow, and they just wander around until somebody leaves something around. It's a fertile environment for targets. So whether it be that or a terrorist, because terrorists, before they attack, and this is not entirely predictable, you can imagine, let's say the present level of terrorism, we often talk about suicide bombers, but whether it's a suicide bomber or it's somebody who's going to hurt or kill somebody, I've never done it. I can only imagine the tensions that happen, the adrenaline rise, or whatever else is going to happen. Their behavior will change. And I guess they want to be effective. So they want to avoid cameras, perhaps, or they want to avoid the cops, or they will do something that not everyone who's passing through that airport will do. So behavioral norms within this environment can be helpful in establishing where you want to target your attention, not to convict somebody, not necessarily to arrest them, but if you've got 20,000 people are now going through Heathrow and you can't look at every one of them, you certainly want to look at the ones who you're worried about, who are potentially going to attack someone. And if you find out they're not, okay, a momentary conversation.
Looking for hands.
Sorry,
yes.
just one of the things,
Sorry.
can you just make me think about it? Is that things such as, one of the things that British Transport Police have done some really good work. Suicide, obviously, is a great problem for society. I'm not sure it's getting worse or better, but it's always an issue. And people will know that, sadly, people use the railway system or roads, but often they do use the railway system. And British Transport Police, together with Railtrack and the rail companies, you have to say that all of us don't like the disruption that's caused. But of course, the worst thing is that somebody died, somebody lost their life that day, and best avoided. So what they calculated was that certain bridges were the places that people chose to do it. Now, I'm not sure they've worked out an algorithm of exactly why that is. We can all probably guess. It might be to avoid someone interrupting them. It may be just it's a beautiful place. It may be significant for them. But it does look as though certain bridges attracted people to do it more often, more frequently. So they've done a lot of work to check those bridges out and make sure that, if you can interrupt it, you do, either by making it physically harder or alternatively frequent patrols or whatever else you could do. And many of, the railway system has got CCTV. Now you could say, well, that's intrusion. If you are looking through CCTV and you had an algorithm applied to unusual behavior, somebody lingering on a bridge, I don't think many of us want to, well, some people do seem to look over motorway bridges quite a lot. I can never quite get it, but they do. That's their choice. But my point is that generally we tend to walk over a bridge because we're trying to get from one place to another. But if there is an unusual behavior there, it might not be a bad idea to reduce suicides, for example, to intervene. So I'll just give another example of where I would say it's a little bit away from facial recognition, but it's where the question drives us. It's not just about recognizing the person, it's checking out the behavior.
We've got time for just a couple more questions, but do put them in. So, yes.
What's the future of surveillance, especially in digital spaces, such as the metaverse?
Sorry, I missed the last bit.
Such as the metaverse, so
Oh, right, okay.
digital spaces. Thank you.
I'm not the world's expert on the meta, okay? So I confess that. But if I understand it correctly, it's a virtual space, isn't it? Where you can be a virtual character and then you interact with other virtual characters, which might represent me or someone else. Sorry, go on.
Mainly, where do you see the future of surveillance in this country and at large?
It's mainly where?
Where do you see the future of surveillance
in
this country and at large?
Oh, okay. I think the first point is I think it's unlikely that there will be less surveillance in the future, there'll have to be more. If for no other reason, I wouldn't like to estimate how many devices we're all carrying today. I happen to have got one. There's every chance that some of us got more than one. It's very hard. I say hard, partly through COVID, but the use of cash has reduced, and the use of credit cards has increased, and the use of other mechanisms, whether it be Apple or all the other things that you can use. And for all the ease of use, it leaves a far clearer trail than cash, which is why criminals still prefer quite often cash, although they will commit a lot of fraud online, as we were discussing earlier. So I think the ways in which we leave a digital trail are increasing, and some of it is joined up. The banking system is joined up, but not all of it is joined up. The people who join it up best are commerce, for the reasons we've already said. Whether you buy from Tesco, Asda, I'll not name every supermarket, but they know what you prefer. They know what they're going to offer you. I was amazed when I remember looking, it's a few years ago, looking at a sofa online, and over the succeeding 4 to 8 weeks, kept getting adverts for sofas, and I thought that's a real coincidence. Of course, it wasn't. It was just me that was being naive. So I think generic surveillance by digital means is increasing because the opportunities are increasing and the amount of data is increasing. And it seems as though there is no limit to the amount of data this world can store at the moment. Think about where the internet was 10 years ago. And we thought we couldn't store this data. Well, we have. And we are continuing because the storage capacity is increasing. And if you get into quantum computing, I guess it will go through the roof again. So I think the likelihood is, I'm not talking necessarily about police surveillance at this stage, I'm just talking about the store of data, is that surveillance generally will increase. And what I don't see is that it dropping off. Now, I've discussed already how some of the police data drops off, for good reasons, or the state's data. But the internet, it's there. You look back 20 years, you're still getting stuff. It's very hard to get rid of it. So I think the likelihood is that there's going to be more. There are going to be more creative opportunities. And I'd say this as a state employee, I guess, as I have been, is that the ones who you'd have to worry about least are the liberal democracies. I think you have to worry about commerce, and I think you have to worry about states which do not have that interest in the very thing we've discussed tonight. So whether that's worrying or not, I think that would be my view. That's what's going to happen.
There's some very interesting fiction that explores some of the future of surveillance. I mean, there's a number of examples. One I quite like, which other people often don't seem to have read. Ken MacLeod wrote an amazing book, Intrusion, set in Scotland, where I think every room by law has a camera to keep track of everything that happens in it to protect people. So it very much explores the idea that is that protection worth it? Which I guess, unless there's anything burning from anybody, I'll take one question rather than the one I was going to have. Oh, sorry, was there one over there? I'll take these two questions and you will be spared my awful question to finish off with. Should we do that one first? We'll bring a microphone over here.
I just wanted to ask, companies, tech companies already hold a lot of data on us. So we're already under surveillance in a way. And I wondered if you could work with them, companies such as Google, or whether that's happening already. So even, I know that Google Maps keeps data on us and tags us essentially, and even knows whether we're walking or cycling. I just have a bit of an interest in that.
I think both the police, security services and the state, generally, countries, do work with people like Google, but there are challenges. Number one is they are international. I mean, if you look at where their profits go, where they're registered, tends to be an Irish base for reasons that I think we all understand. So I think that one of the problems is that they are international in dimensions, but jurisdictions tend to be national in nature, which means that therefore the ability to intervene with these people is hard. Their capital base is huge. Their ability to spend, the amount of money they have is just huge. And it's clear that at times, I have to be careful because I'm not sure I've got evidence for what I'm about to say, but I'll say it. This is my intuition. At times they've intimidated governments as well as they've enabled things. But the area which I could say something with some credibility is around, the police have, in this country, but also in others, have challenged people like Google Apple, about getting access to encrypted data for, to Julian's point, I would say good reason, but I think we all might agree. You know, if you've got child abuse images, got terrorism, let's just stick at the top end of crime. Let's forget about lower stuff. And forgetting about lower stuff, what you're acknowledging is things like harassment online. Some of it is pretty vile, includes threats to life. I think there's limits to how much we can achieve in that area, but it's a fact. And the companies have been slow, given their resources, to react. Now, sometimes they argue commercial advantage. Sometimes they say it's just too much. That I don't accept. I think if they really thought it was a priority, they'd do something about it. So I think that they've, because of their reach, the first point I made, they exceed even America's reach to influence them. And they don't always listen in a way that I think is not law enforcement centric, but it's public safety centric. It can be lower on their priority list. So yeah, the conversations take place. If you could argue that all they're doing is protecting their commercial rights lawfully, I think they're a bit slow sometimes and selfish.
Just while we wait for this final question, we do have a number of events coming up where we've got Twitter's head of global public policy coming to speak and the head of the Facebook Oversight Board. So there's a number of other events here to explore some of those, and we can talk encryption some other time. Over to you.
Yeah, so when the police use these technologies, there's an awful load of checks and balances. But if I go home, I can run reverse image searches. I can do a whole lot of things online that a police officer may not be able to do. I can search against all of Instagram, that kind of thing. What do you think the relationship should be between the UK police and potentially a global public that may be calling in all sorts of things for whatever their ends may be?
Well, I've avoided using the argument that you've made very well, which is that it seems to me that there would be a strange irony if an individual victim of crime could do far more to investigate their own crime than the people who were charged with the duty of investigating it. I think sometimes that happens. Partly it's because the police don't always keep up to pace, you know, or they haven't invested in the right areas. But also there's a belief that, you know, the law holds the state to a higher level than they would an individual. I mean, I'll just give you one very quick example. As an employer, I used to be in charge of HR for the Met before I was a commissioner in charge for HR. But I didn't know much about HR. I did my best to learn, but you know, we have 50,000 people, and obviously you recruit. You employ some people who do waste your time. You employ people who aren't ill, but say they are. You employ people who get pensions they don't deserve. It seems to me that it's not a bad idea to find out who they are. Apart from the fact they're wasting our time, and that annoys me. But it is public money. And we looked at how we could surveil our own staff where we had good cause, not just randomly go and see whether, having said they were ill, they weren't ill, but where we had intelligence information that in fact they were being dishonest about this. Now, there were relatively small numbers. I'm not saying everybody in 50,000 were, but there were some. But what we were shown by a very good lawyer who's now in the House of Lords is that the state, this is in Europe, it applies now, the state cannot surveil its own staff unless it has one of the surveillance authorities I mentioned earlier under the RIPA Act. But if you were Marks and Spencer's, you could. So this dichotomy, which you highlight, I think is a tension. Equally, I think, you know, if you are the police, I think you should be held to higher standards. And the consequences of the police doing their job can lead to more serious consequences for the citizen. So I think quite properly there will be different standards. But I think if we allow that gap to get too far, so that somebody says, well, I found my stolen bike, I know who did it, and you're telling me you can't even look, will be a bizarre outcome. But I do think having higher standards is a good thing, not a bad.
There is so much more we could pick up on, but I think we're going to have to finish it there. So Bernard, thank you very much for your thoughtful answers. I hope everyone who's joined us has found it interesting as well. Please do, just before we finish, join me in a round of applause. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to bring in all the questions online or here. There were a number of very interesting threads about COVID passports, about mental health issues. But I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and I hope you'll come to some of our other events. So tomorrow evening, we're having a talk here from our own Claire Chambers, talking about her book Intact, in favour of the unmodified body. What are the pressures to modify our bodies? We have an amazing Japanese film, UK premiere, Voice of Sid, a cold case film. On Tuesday, on the 7th, we have Lem Sisse, and we have many, many, many more events. So please do come along to them in person or online, but wherever you are, have a very good evening. Thanks.